Before we step into the ancient world, before the clay tablets whisper their secrets, before the oldest memories of humanity drift back into the light, I want you to pause for a moment and listen to your own silence. Because every great mystery begins this way, not with evidence, not with revelation, but with a quiet, persistent question that lingers at the edge of your awareness. A question you may have felt before, in moments when the present feels too thin to be the whole truth. A question that rises whenever you sense that the story of humanity is deeper and darker and older than anything written in books. The question is simple but unsettling. How much of our story have we forgotten? You felt this question in museums, where ancient objects feel heavier than their size. In ruins, where warm wind moves through stones carved by hands you will never meet. In old books, whose pages smell like dust and time. In dreams that feel older than your own memories. It is the sense that something vast lies behind you, something long buried, yet still faintly alive. Tonight, that question becomes a doorway. Because the story we are about to explore is not just the story of a civilization. It is the story of memory itself. What humanity once knew, what it tried desperately to preserve, and what was ultimately washed away by time, leaving only fragments pressed into clay. Before we begin this descent, I want you to do something small, something gentle. If you feel awake enough, tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Are you lying in bed in a quiet, dark room? Are you listening through headphones during a night shift? Are you on a train, watching lights blur past? Are you halfway across the world, unable to sleep, seeking calm in the soft glow of the screen? Wherever you are, let me know. Because somewhere, as you listen, someone else is doing the same. A stranger, another traveler in the night, following this story beside you. Now let the stillness deepen. Feel the air settle. We begin. Imagine standing in a vast desert before dawn. The sky is dark but softened with the faintest breath of light. The air is cool, yet the earth beneath your feet remembers heat older than cities, older than writing, older than any name you have ever heard. Beneath this ground lie thousands of clay tablets, the earliest written records humanity has ever found. But what they contain is not the beginning of civilization. It feels more like the continuation of something older. That is the first mystery. Civilizations are supposed to begin slowly, stumbling through trial and error, gradually learning how to build cities, create symbols, organize people, record thoughts. But Sumer does not stumble. Sumer arrives, fully formed, fully articulate, fully aware. The earliest tablets are not hesitant attempts at writing. They are confident, structured, detailed. They describe complex administration, astronomy, mathematics, religious rituals, agricultural systems, not the clumsy beginnings of a society learning to speak, but the controlled voice of a society that already remembers something. That sense of remembrance runs through everything the Sumerians left behind. Their temples were built not as experiments, but as restorations. Structures raised in the belief that they were rebuilding something much older. Their mathematics does not behave like an invention. It behaves like a survival. Their myths do not tell the story of a people discovering the world. They tell the story of a people trying to recall a world that had already been lost. One line appears repeatedly across early tablets, quietly, almost apologetically. This is the restoration of what was before. Not the beginning, the restoration. Imagine the implications of those words. The first writers humanity ever produced believed they were rebuilding memory, not creating it. The desert remembers, even when we do not. When archaeologists first dug through the plains near ancient Uruk, they expected the familiar pattern: simple beginnings, slow innovations, the gradual rise from small settlements to complex society. Instead, they found a civilization stepping out of silence as if it had been waiting, not crawling forward, but emerging fully awake. The first cities of Sumer were not simple villages. They were monumental, geometrically aligned, engineered with precision. Their architecture suggests not invention, but practice, the way someone writes with confidence because they have written for many years before. The earliest laws were not primitive. They were specific, organized, concerned with fairness in a way that suggests centuries of ethical debate before the first word was carved. Even their religious ideas are unsettling in their depth. They did not create simple gods attached to storms or rivers or fear. They created systems, cosmic hierarchies, layered metaphysics, structured spiritual domains. Their myths feel philosophical from the beginning, as if they were crafted by people who already knew the weight of cosmology. Something happened before Sumer, something the world forgot, and the Sumerians seemed to know it. Consider for a moment the clay itself. Clay tablets are almost unnatural in their durability. Papyrus decays, wood rots, leather melts into soil, ink fades. But clay, once dried and buried, becomes stubborn. It resists time. It resists destruction. It survives flood and fire. It outlasts its creators. It is almost as if the Sumerians deliberately chose a medium meant to survive catastrophe, as if they had lived through something that taught them how easily knowledge can drown, as if they feared the world might forget again. And so they pressed meaning into clay with careful hands, not as if they were beginning a history, but as if they were trying to save the last traces of an older one. The silence before Sumer is not an empty silence. It is a silence full of erased stories, coastlines drowned when the world warmed at the end of the last ice age, settlements swallowed by rising seas, communities displaced by floods that transformed entire landscapes. Many ancient cultures speak of a flood that ended something. Not one culture, many. It is not proof of a literal event, but it is proof of memory. Memory carried through myth. Memory that survived because stories can travel farther than stone. Under the layers of Sumer's cities are older villages, older fire pits, older bones. People lived there long before writing. People built. People traded. People worshipped. People buried their dead with ritual care. These lives are invisible in textbooks because they left no script behind. But they existed, and the sudden appearance of writing in Sumer does not erase their long presence. It highlights it. Because the world Sumer built did not emerge from emptiness. It emerged from thousands of years of cultures the earth absorbed, but could not fully preserve. Even the Sumerian language is a mystery. It appears suddenly, with no known relatives, not a descendant, not a branch of a linguistic tree, an orphan language, a voice with no clear ancestor. a grammar that seems to come from nowhere and yet carries complexity that suggests a long evolution. Languages do not normally appear this way. Civilizations do not normally appear this way. Knowledge does not normally appear this way. Unless Sumer was not the beginning, unless Sumer was the echo of a beginning. The more you read the clay tablets, the more that sense intensifies. There is a confidence in them, a certainty, a familiarity with the cosmos, the calendar, the measure of time. These do not sound like first attempts. They sound like memories of older systems, systems refined long before history began. Imagine holding one of these tablets. It fits in your hand like a small artifact of eternity. The marks pressed into it are deliberate, as if someone knew that what they were writing needed to survive ages of silence. Clay carries a kind of weight that ink cannot. It is a material chosen by people who have learned to fear forgetting. And there is something tender in that fear, something human, something that suggests that the great mystery of Sumer is not how advanced they were, but how deeply they cared about memory. Because that is the quiet truth hidden beneath all their records. Sumer is not the story of a people discovering civilization. Sumer is the story of a people trying to hold on to something the world had already lost. Tonight, we will follow them into that silence, not to solve the mystery, but to understand it. And as we descend into their world, the desert winds begin to rise again, cold and ancient, carrying the first hint of what lies beneath the clay. The wind moves softly over the plains of ancient Mesopotamia, lifting grains of sand, the way memory lifts fragments of forgotten time. You can almost hear the past breathing there, quiet, patient, waiting. If you stand long enough in that silence, your mind begins to soften, and you sense the faint echo of footsteps beneath the earth. Steps that belonged to people who walked these lands long before cities rose, long before clay was pressed into meaning. People who lived and died without names we can pronounce, without stories we can read, without leaving a trail that survived the shifting of rivers or the rising of seas. And yet, somehow, when Sumer finally emerged into history, it spoke with the certainty of those who remembered. Archaeologists often describe the first appearance of Sumerian writing as if someone turned on a light in a room that had always been dark. One moment, silence. The next, full sentences carved into time. But if you look closely, the metaphor is wrong. It was not a light switching on. It was a distant glow that had never fully gone out. A glow carried through centuries of unwritten life, through rituals performed in the shadow of mountains, through oral traditions whispered across generations, through the hands of craftsmen shaping clay long before writing existed. When the first tablets appeared, they were not the clumsy attempts of a society learning to write. They were the confident marks of people who had already been counting, recording, measuring, and organizing life long before ink met clay. Writing did not begin as storytelling in Sumer. It began as administration: grain, cattle, trade routes, temple inventories. These are not the expressions of a society finding its voice. They are the tasks of a society that had already been speaking in systems too old to track. It raises a question that feels heavier than the clay itself. How long does a civilization exist before it decides to write? because the first written evidence of Sumer feels like a mid-sentence moment, not the opening line of a story. A continuation, not a beginning. You can feel it even in the layout of their cities. Uruk did not grow organically like other early settlements. Its footprint suggests planning. Streets aligned with intention, temple districts shaped with architectural memory, walls tracing the form of a city that had existed in the minds of its builders before it existed in stone. When a culture builds as if repeating something rather than inventing it, you begin to understand why the earliest Sumerian hymns speak of cycles, of ages rising and falling, of worlds beginning and ending, of knowledge descending and withdrawing like the tides. Their myths describe eras before their era, not with exaggeration, but with specificity. Not as fantasy, but as memory. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how calmly they accepted this. The Sumerians did not behave like people who believed they were the first. They behaved like people who knew they were rebuilding the last fragments of something older. Walk through the ruins of Eridu, a city they believed was the first city ever created on Earth. Its oldest layers reveal small, humble shrines built long before the larger temples that came later. The foundations shift over generations, expanding, contracting, evolving, yet always in the same sacred footprint. As if each generation remembered the last. As if each generation knew exactly where the oldest altar had once stood. As if they were restoring something their ancestors had already restored. Archaeologists counting the layers realized something strange. Eridu's temple was rebuilt more than 20 times, demolished, rebuilt, expanded, refined, each reconstruction following a memory older than the builders themselves. Why return to the same layout over and over? Why cling so strongly to the original plan? Unless the original plan came from somewhere the Sumerians believed was worth preserving. There is a stillness in these ancient brick foundations, a quiet focus, as if the builders knew something fragile needed to survive. And then there is the sky. The Sumerians mapped the heavens with a precision that does not belong to a civilization at the beginning of its learning. Their calendars were not experimental. Their star charts were not tentative. Their lunar observations were not approximations. They tracked cycles with a mathematical sophistication that suggests generations of earlier skywatchers refining the system. People who stood under night skies far darker than ours, watching the slow turning of the heavens until patterns emerged like constellations in their minds. It is difficult to imagine how much time it takes to notice patterns across decades, centuries, millennia. To understand when a star rises slightly earlier than before. To measure the drift of constellations. To watch the moon repeat its phases until the cycles reveal themselves like ancient rhythms. And yet, the earliest Sumerian astronomers speak of these cycles not as new discoveries, but as inherited knowledge. Something taught, something given, something preserved. If you listen to their oldest hymns, the tone is unmistakable. The stars were not mysteries to uncover, they were memories to restore. The deeper you go into Sumerian history, the more the pattern repeats. They do not claim to be inventors, they claim to be rememberers, custodians of knowledge that survived something their myths call the Great Forgetting, often symbolized as a flood, not always literal, but always transformative, a breaking of continuity. And this brings us to the most fragile piece of the puzzle, the Sumerian language. It stands alone, a linguistic island with no shore, no neighbouring dialects, no ancestral tree leading into it. The words feel old and yet rootless, as if they came from a world that no longer has a footprint in ours. Language does not usually appear like this. It evolves slowly, branching, mutating, leaving trails behind. But Sumerian arrives like a visitor, complete, confident, structured, without siblings or parents. Even now, linguists debate its origin. Some propose contact with older cultures erased by time. Some suggest it was the last surviving member of a family of languages drowned by prehistoric migrations. Some believe it was a relic carried from an earlier world, maintained through oral tradition until writing finally gave it permanence. Whatever the explanation, its existence is a quiet rupture in our understanding of history, because languages do not normally begin in silence. They leave traces, they echo, they leave cousins behind. Sumerian did not. It arrived alone, like a voice speaking across a gulf of time. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of this story, because everything in Sumer feels like that, like a message carried across darkness, surviving only in fragments, restored by people who knew they were holding something they did not completely understand, but felt compelled to preserve. Imagine the first scribes pressing marks into clay by lamplight, the glow flickering across their hands. They were not authors in the modern sense. They were archivists of a memory older than themselves. The clay beneath their fingertips was wet and heavy, carrying the scent of the river, the earth, the past. Each line they pressed felt like a promise, an effort to ensure the world would not forget again. There is something deeply human in that gesture, the fear of forgetting, the desire to preserve, the instinct to hold on to meaning in a world that changes too quickly for memory to survive. You can almost feel their urgency through the tablets, not panic but devotion, not chaos but careful attention. They wrote as if the world depended on it, as if they understood that civilizations rise and fall, but clay survives. As if they knew that whatever came before had been lost, and they did not want to repeat that silence. The Sumerians created lists of kings stretching back into ages their tablets call before the flood. They recorded stories of heavenly beings teaching humanity how to measure time, how to plant seeds, how to build cities, how to count. They wrote hymns describing eras when humans lived differently, thought differently, understood the cosmos differently. Not exaggerations, not fantasies, but memories encoded into the only medium they believed would outlast catastrophe. And yet, as their tablets accumulated, as their cities grew in wealth and influence, as their culture blossomed into art and philosophy, something strange happened. The more the Sumerians wrote, the more they insisted they were not the beginning. They never claimed to be the first humans, never claimed to be the first thinkers, never claimed to be the first engineers, never claimed to be the first stargazers. Instead, they speak of the ones who came before. Not in mystical terms, but in historical ones, as if their ancestors belonged to an age the world would not remember. And one day, as the plains dried, as rivers shifted, as empires rose around them, as languages changed, as time flowed, the Sumerians themselves became part of the silence they once tried to prevent. Their cities crumbled, clay tablets sank into the earth. Their language faded from memory. Their rituals disappeared. Their names dissolved into dust. It is only by chance that we found them again. Only by chance that the clay survived. Only by chance that their voice was not lost forever. And now, As we stand in the present, holding those tablets in museums and archives, we are once again confronted by the same quiet question. If Sumer remembered something the world forgot, what was it? The question lingers in the dim edges of the mind, drifting like smoke rising from an ancient oil lamp. It settles slowly, gently, refusing to bring clarity all at once. Some questions do not arrive with answers. They arrive with presence. And this question, what did Sumer remember, has a presence that feels older than civilization itself. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine the earliest Sumerian scribes at work, you can almost hear the soft scratch of stylus against clay, the faint hiss of wet earth being shaped into symbols. You can picture the room around them, the low walls of fired brick, the shadows cast by flickering flame, the scent of river air drifting in from the world outside. Their posture is careful, deliberate. They are not writing casually. They are writing as if what they record must endure longer than they will. They are pressing memory into matter. And yet, in their tablets, there is a strange humility. They do not claim to be the heirs of recent beginnings. They speak instead of older ages, long cycles of time, long rises and falls, long histories that have only partially survived. They describe kings who reigned for centuries, not as literal rulers, but as figures from memory stretched over generations of storytelling. They describe eras when the world was younger, not in mythical fantasy, but in a tone that feels like echo and grief and remembrance. When the Sumerians speak of the before time, their words carry a weight that modern readers misinterpret. They are not imagining a magical world. They are remembering a fragmentary world. A world altered by events that reshaped the earth. Rising seas swallowing coastlines. Rivers changing course after long droughts. Sudden floods erasing entire regions. Migrations dispersing cultures beyond recognition. Memory in such conditions does not vanish all at once. It fractures, it distorts, it dissolves in pieces, and what remains becomes story. Stories are not less true than records. They are simply a different kind of truth. Imagine a community living through unimaginable environmental collapse. Their settlements washed away, their markers of identity scattered, their elders lost, their rituals disrupted, their knowledge broken into fragments. What survives becomes myth, not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. Sumer's oldest myths feel like that, like the last surviving embers of something older, something experienced by people who lived before writing, before cities, before the clay tablets tried to salvage what remained. Take the Great Flood narrative, for example. The tablet tradition frames it not as a singular event, but as part of a cycle. Floods are not portrayed as punishment, they are portrayed as resets, events that change the world and force humanity to begin again. This resonates far beyond Sumer. Cultures across the Near East, the Mediterranean, South Asia, and even distant regions such as Northern Europe and the Americas contain flood stories. Not identical, not copied, but resonant. The emotional core is the same, a world lost, a world rebuilt. Scholars do not treat these as literal global floods, but as collective memories of repeated post-Ice Age sea level rises that transformed the world dramatically between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. Coastlines retreated, plains drowned, forests disappeared beneath rising waters, entire cultures would have been displaced. Stories would have been carried inland by survivors. Those stories would have changed shape, but not meaning. Sumer may have been one of the first cultures to write them down, but they were not the first to feel them. This is why their earliest texts feel like they are trying to catch something that is almost out of reach, something fading even as they press it into clay, a memory dissolving at the edges. If you walk through the ruins of ancient cities like Ur or Lagash, you feel that same sense of memory hovering in the quiet air. The streets are dust now, the ziggurats collapsed into stepped mounds, the canals dry beneath the sun. But the layout remains, the geometry remains, the alignment remains, the orientation toward the stars remains. These choices were not random, they were inherited habits, rituals carried forward from a past older than the cities themselves. Cities are expressions of memory. Even their shape holds stories. And Sumer's cities were shaped by a memory the tablets only faintly describe. Consider how advanced their organization was from the very beginning. They had a legal system that distinguished civil disputes from criminal ones. They had temples functioning not only as spiritual centers, but as administrative, economic, and educational institutions. They had schools for scribes. They had specialized professions, metalworkers, carpenters, potters, physicians, merchants, astronomers. These professions do not appear spontaneously. They require long histories of apprenticeship, tradition, refinement. Everything about Sumer suggests continuity, but continuity from where? The deeper layers beneath their cities reveal a quiet truth. The late Neolithic cultures that preceded Sumer were not simple. They were complex in their own way. Organized settlements with specialized buildings, engraved symbolic objects, ritualized burial practices, long-distance trade networks extending hundreds of miles. These cultures had caretakers of memory too. They had stories, traditions, cosmologies, but they left no written record, and the earth absorbed most of their whispers. When the waters receded, when the climate settled, when stability returned to the fragile post-Ice Age world, the people who would later become the Sumerians carried forward the fragments they could, and when writing emerged, they recorded what remained. They wrote about gods and ancestors, not because they believed these stories were fantasies, but because myth was the only vessel strong enough to carry the memory of a world that no longer existed. You can feel this in their descriptions of knowledge descending to humanity, as if the skills of measurement and architecture and healing were not invented, but returned. They do not speak like inventors. They speak like people remembering a dream. Their language, isolated, ancient, structurally unique, intensifies this feeling. Linguistic isolates often represent the last surviving members of once larger language families washed away by migrations. The Sumerians may have been the last inheritors of a tradition that survived catastrophe, a voice kept alive through centuries of oral recitation before finding a home in clay. Imagine being one of those early scribes. You are writing in a tongue that has echoes but no neighbors, a language that vibrates with the resonance of older forms now gone. You press marks into clay by lamplight, preserving stories recited to you since childhood, stories told to your parents by theirs, and theirs by ancestors whose names are already half forgotten. You do not write to create, you write to remember. But clay is patient. It remembers longer than human minds. It holds meaning even when cultures crumble. And because of clay, we have access to these echoes now. One of the strangest features of Sumer's earliest tablets is the way they describe kingship descending from heaven. Modern people mistake this phrasing for a literal claim, but in Sumerian cosmology, heaven is not a place. It is a metaphor for order, structure, legitimacy. Kingship does not descend from the sky. It descends from the memory of earlier ages. Kingship is restored, not invented. Authority is inherited from cycles of time that predate the written world. This metaphor appears again in their descriptions of cities. Eridu, the first city, was not called first because it was the oldest settlement in the region. It wasn't. It was called first because they believed it was the first time order returned after a long age of forgetting. They saw themselves not as builders, but as rebuilders. You see this philosophy even in their medical texts. Their earliest physicians wrote remedies for ailments using herbs, oils, minerals. But they always wrote as if the remedies were old, ancient formulas reclaimed from earlier worlds. They did not claim discovery, they claimed restoration. Every part of Sumer's identity reflects this idea of returning to something, a cycle closing so that a new one can begin. If you read the Sumerian king list carefully, you see not a historical record, but a memory scaffold, an attempt to arrange fragments of recollection into a lineage that feels coherent. Reigns stretch across centuries not because the Sumerians believed their kings were immortal, but because the memory of those early eras was stretched across multiple generations. Each name represents not a man, but a period, an epoch, an identity compressed by time. This is how memory behaves when it survives through oral tradition. It condenses, it blurs, it becomes symbolic. Even the stories of gods and half-divine beings teaching humanity are symbolic memories of cultural shifts, new knowledge arriving like light after darkness. Everything in Sumer is shaped by this tension between remembering and forgetting. The tablets feel like an attempt to freeze the last fragments of human memory before they disappeared entirely. And the more they wrote, the clearer the pattern becomes. They were not writing history, they were writing the recovery of history. The deeper you go, the more the question grows. Not as fear, not as confusion, but as quiet awe. What came before? What world was lost? What knowledge survived only as symbols and myth? What did the Sumerians inherit that the world had already forgotten? And why does it feel, now, thousands of years later, as if those same tablets are asking us to remember something too? The question sits there quietly, not demanding an answer, only asking you to keep listening. Because some truths do not reveal themselves suddenly. They reveal themselves the way dawn does. First, a shadow softens, then a contour emerges, then the shape becomes visible by degrees, until finally you realize you are standing in a world that was always there, waiting for your eyes to adjust. Sumer is like that. The more you look, the more the familiar shape of its civilization dissolves into something older, something deeper, something that feels less like an origin and more like an echo. The echo of a world that existed before writing, before the great river valleys filled with cities, before the first kings placed crowns on their heads and claimed dominion over land shaped by older hands. It is tempting to imagine Sumer as the beginning of everything we recognize: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture, architecture. But beginnings rarely arrive fully formed. Real beginnings are messy, tentative, uneven. They leave mistakes behind. They reveal evolution, not perfection. Sumer does not feel like that. Sumer feels like walking into a library whose books were already written long before the doors opened. Take the way they measured time. The sexagesimal system, base 60, is astonishingly elegant. It divides circles smoothly. It harmonizes with the cycles of the heavens. It allows for fractions with ease. It remains in our clocks and our compasses thousands of years later. And yet, the earliest Sumerian tablets use it as if it were already ancient, as if nobody there remembered a time when numbers were counted any other way. Base 60 does not feel like an invention. It feels like an inheritance. Or consider their myths, those strange, beautiful narratives carved into tablets with the quiet confidence of people who believed they were preserving more than they were creating. The story of Inanna descending into the underworld, the rivalry of the gods over the order of the heavens, the emergence of kingship, the balance between chaos and harmony, the flood that resets the world. None of these stories are simplistic. None read like the early imagination of a young culture. They read like the matured philosophy of a people who had pondered existence for centuries, maybe millennia. But myths do not come from nothing. They grow from memory, the kind of memory that refuses to disappear entirely, even when the world around it changes. One of the strangest pieces of evidence for this lies in the tablets describing the rebuilding of temples after disasters. They speak of renovations, restorations, reconstructions. They speak of priests relocating sacred objects from older, damaged buildings into newer ones. They speak of rituals repeated as they were before. The phrasing is consistent, quiet, and telling. It hints at a line of tradition carried through events they never fully describe. This is where archaeology and myth begin to whisper the same story. Because the world Sumer inherited had gone through violent transformations, floods, droughts, migrations, climate events so severe they would have reshaped entire landscapes. We know this not from story, but from soil. The sediment layers in southern Mesopotamia record dramatic environmental shifts around the time oral traditions describe their mythical flood. Not necessarily a single world-ending flood, but a series of rapid events that would have erased coastlines, overwhelmed settlements, and displaced entire cultures. Imagine living through something like that, watching the world you knew swallowed by rising waters. Imagine being among the survivors, carrying only fragments of memory. Imagine trying to preserve meaning in an era when everything familiar dissolves. This is how myths are born, not as fantasies, but as memorials. And the Sumerians wrote their memorials into clay. If you listen closely, a pattern begins to emerge. Not the pattern of one culture inventing civilization, but the pattern of inherited knowledge becoming fragile. A pattern of caretakers desperately trying to preserve what was left. A pattern of symbols carrying meaning long after the memory behind them had faded. Even the way the Sumerians built their cities reflects this. Their ziggurats were not simple temples. They were layered structures, platform upon platform, each rising above the last like a mountain built from memory. They believed mountains connected the earth to the heavens. They believed knowledge descended down those sacred heights. They believed the highest point of the city was where memory touched eternity. And so they built artificial mountains out of brick and fire, so that every generation would remember where knowledge came from. Perhaps the most haunting detail is that the earliest ziggurats were not the most elaborate. They were the simplest. Humble platforms topped with shrines, rebuilt again and again, each layer preserving the base beneath. When you peel these structures apart, you find the earliest versions of the bottom, small, simple, intentional. The same footprint, the same orientation, the same devotion. It is as if the Sumerians inherited a blueprint older than themselves, a design repeated through centuries of rebuilding, a remembrance of sacred architecture long after the original builders were gone. Even the clay tablets describing tools and measurements hint at this continuity. They speak of standard units, cubit lengths, volume measures, area formulas, as if these systems were restored rather than created, as if the knowledge of proportions was something once known broadly and then lost for a time before Sumer revived it. But the clearest evidence of inherited knowledge lies in a place most people never think to look: their oldest schools. Archaeologists have found classrooms in ancient Sumer filled with discarded practice tablets, lists, calculations, exercises. Young scribes sat in rows, copying texts that were already ancient when they were learning them. The content of these tablets is not exploratory, it is preservative. Their learning was not experimental, it was restorative. The Sumerians were reconstructing something. Their writing system, cuneiform, also hints at this. Early cuneiform is not the clumsy scrawl of experiment. It is the rigid, careful, symmetrical system of a tradition that had already been refined. Writing does not typically appear in fully matured form, but in Sumer it does. This is why their earliest tablets feel like the second or third draft of an idea, not the first. A beginning, polished before it reached history. At some point, a shift happens in your understanding. You stop thinking of Sumer as the first civilization and begin thinking of it as the first civilization that survived. The first to write. The first to capture the flickering remnants of memory in material that would endure. The first to fight against the forgetting that swallowed whatever came before. And the more you explore their world, the more the boundaries of identity blur. You begin to see not a single culture rising out of emptiness, but a lineage of forgotten cultures flowing into Sumer like rivers merging into a delta. Cultures that left no writing. Cultures erased by time, by climate, by migration, by catastrophe. Cultures whose symbols evolved into the symbols the Sumerians carved into stone. It is here that the deepest meaning of the Sumerian record reveals itself. They were not writing to tell the world who they were. They were writing to preserve the last light of who humanity had been. Their tablets were lanterns placed along the dark corridor of time. And now, thousands of years later, when we pick them up and read them under museum lights, we find ourselves staring into the faint glow of an older world, a world that no longer exists, a world remembered only in metaphor and clay. As you absorb this, the question grows quieter but sharper. It becomes less like a whisper and more like a presence beside you. If Sumer remembered fragments of an earlier world, what happened to that world? Where did it go? What knowledge did it carry? And why does so little of it remain? The clay tablets fall silent here, not because they hold no answer, but because some answers lie beneath history, not within it. Some silences feel empty, and some feel full. The silence beneath Sumer feels impossibly full, as if thousands of years of human footsteps were absorbed into the ground, leaving only the thinnest traces for the future to uncover. The world before Sumer is like a hallway lined with closed doors. We cannot open them, but we can hear faint echoes through the wood. Echoes of hands shaping tools, of voices singing in languages that no longer exist, of stories carried across campfires in a world where time moved differently. And yet, Sumer stands at the threshold of those doors, not as the first who walked those halls, but as the first who tried to write down what they could still hear. If you sit with that idea for a while, really sit with it, the weight of those early tablets changes. They stop feeling like the beginning of history and start feeling like the last attempt to rescue memory from oblivion. Each tablet becomes a gesture of resistance, a way to defy the river of forgetting that had swallowed ages before theirs. There is a peculiar loneliness in being the first to write. Imagine realizing you are the first generation in human existence able to preserve words beyond a single lifetime. Imagine feeling the pressure of that responsibility. Imagine knowing that what you record might outlast every voice around you. The scribes must have felt this. There is devotion in their work, a devotion to accuracy, to structure, to repetition. The kind of devotion that only appears when the stakes are impossibly high. They wrote not for themselves, but for the world that might come after theirs. They wrote so the future could remember something the earth itself had almost forgotten. And perhaps that is why their earliest texts are filled with lists, measurements, inventories, administrative records. Modern people find these boring, but they were the scaffolding of civilization. Scribes preserved the most fragile parts of life, the parts most easily lost when disaster strikes. Grain counts, fields measured, resources allocated, temple supplies catalogued. These are the details that sustain a society, details that disappear first when the world collapses. The Sumerians wrote down the practical world because they knew how. Quickly, the practical world can vanish. They wrote the foundations first, the necessities, the bones of society. They wrote as if memory begins with order. Only after order was secured did their writing expand into myth and poetry, hymns and lamentations, law codes and philosophy. It is almost as if their civilization grew upward from writing itself. They built a recorded world, layer by layer, the same way they built their ziggurats. Yet even in those first practical texts, you see glimpses of something older. A measurement that has no known origin. A ritual described as the ancient way. A symbol that appears suddenly without earlier versions. A word whose roots are lost. Little hints, little fractures where the light of a deeper past shines through. One of the most mysterious of these hints lies in their astronomy. The Sumerians charted the movements of planets with care. They tracked the path of Venus in a cycle that repeats every 8 years almost perfectly. They knew the length of the lunar month with surprising accuracy. They marked solstices and equinoxes in ways that suggest long, careful observation. But the question is, how long does careful observation take? To identify the pattern of Venus, you need decades of records. To track lunar drift, you need generations of comparison. To understand the subtle precession of certain stars, you need centuries of attention. Yet the earliest Sumerian astronomical texts behave as if such knowledge was already old. There is no sense of discovery. There is a sense of continuity. They write as if they are maintaining a system, not creating one. And here is where the silence beneath their civilization grows deeper. Because archaeology shows there were settlements in Mesopotamia long before Sumer. Cultures with symbolic objects, ritual structures, shared artistic styles. These people lived through massive environmental upheaval. They witnessed rivers changing course. They survived droughts that lasted centuries. They rebuilt their world multiple times. Their memory stretched through repeated cycles of collapse and renewal. When you think of this, you begin to see the outline of a truth that feels familiar across human history. Civilizations do not rise once. They rise many times. And each time they rise, they carry forward fragments of what came before. Sumer was not the first. It was simply the brightest spark after a long night. But sparks do not arise from emptiness. They come from embers. The earliest Sumerians lived alongside those embers. You can see this in the ancient layers of pottery styles. Some patterns appear suddenly, with no local evolution. They resemble designs found in distant regions. This suggests trade networks existed long before cities. People moved across vast distances. Ideas traveled. Techniques were shared. Memory was distributed quietly through human movement, long before it was recorded. You see it in burial practices too. Certain graves contain objects that imply beliefs in an afterlife. Others contain bodies arranged with care, accompanied by goods meant for the journey. These rituals do not match what we see in Sumer. They are older, different, suggesting that spiritual ideas existed long before the Sumerians shaped them into written mythology. And then there are the strange objects found at early sites, tools carved with symbols whose meaning is unknown, stones engraved with patterns that do not reappear later, artifacts that resemble early forms of writing but do not follow any known script. These items are rare, but they exist. They are fragments of a symbolic world that rose and fell before writing became stable. The silence deepens. This is the part of the story that slips between the cracks of history, not lost through carelessness, but erased by time itself. The last ice age ended violently. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet. Entire plains vanished underwater. Coastlines redrew themselves across continents. Some of the oldest human settlements now lie miles beneath the waves, unreachable. Whatever cultures lived there, whatever memory they carried, disappeared beneath the water. But memory does not drown instantly. It drifts. It survives in the stories carried by those who fled inland. It survives in ritual patterns repeated by their children's children. It survives in architectural habits, in symbols carved without meaning understood, in myths spoken long after the events that inspired them. Sumer inherited these memories, and though they wrote them down with reverence, the world above them has forgotten how to read the silence between the words. This is why the Sumerian king list feels like a dream. The list spans thousands of years, describing rulers whose reigns stretch beyond the limits of possibility. Scholars read these reigns symbolically, representing eras rather than individuals. But the structure of the list feels older than the writing itself. It feels like the written form of an oral tradition that had been repeated so many times it became myth wrapped around memory. And then there are the strange details, the precise numbers, the repeated patterns, the rhythmic structure of time. These are not the inventions of scribes. They are echoes of stories that survived countless retellings, stories passed down through people who remembered only fragments, holding on to what they could as generations dissolved behind them. The Sumerians pressed those fragments into clay with the quiet hope that they would survive. They did. But fragments raise more questions than answers, especially one question that grows heavier with every tablet read, every ruin explored, every artifact uncovered from the layers beneath Sumer. If they were restoring knowledge, what kind of knowledge had been lost? What kind of knowledge had been lost? It is a question that settles into the mind like dust settling onto an ancient floor, slow, silent, inevitable. The more you explore Sumer, the more that question stops sounding speculative and starts feeling like an ache. Because everything the Sumerians wrote carries the strange weight of people trying to remember something rather than invent it. A weight that does not belong to a first civilization, but to a civilization standing on the bones of worlds forgotten. When you walk the ruins of their cities, even the ones still buried beneath layers of clay, you notice something subtle. Their architecture carries a rhythm. Not symmetry, not style, but rhythm. The repetition of proportions, the alignment of walls, the placement of courtyards, the exact angles used in temple layouts. These rhythms are too consistent to be accidental. They reflect a system, geometric, conceptual, and deeply ancient. Civilizations rarely begin with systems. Systems imply tradition. Systems imply long practice. Systems imply memory. So again the question returns, not louder, but closer. Where did that memory come from? Imagine a world before writing, a vast stretch of time where humans lived through cycles of abundance and collapse, of warmth and cold, of migrations forced by changes in climate no one could predict. For thousands of years before Sumer, people moved with the rivers, with the rains, with the stars. They carried knowledge like fire, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, but always alive. Techniques for planting, building, healing, carving, measuring. Rituals for transitioning between seasons. Ways of predicting floods, winds, eclipses. Stories explaining the turning of time. Knowledge lived in people, not on tablets. And people are fragile. When disaster strikes, written knowledge can be preserved, but unwritten knowledge dies with the people who hold it. If a generation fails to pass its memory forward because of drought, flood, war, displacement, that memory dissolves. Entire languages vanish that way, entire traditions, entire cosmologies. And yet, fragments survive. A ritual repeated without understanding. A symbol carved because it has always been carved. A pattern aligned to a star whose meaning is forgotten. A story told in the wrong order because the original teller is long gone. Sumer inherited these fragments, and the clay tablets preserved them in whatever form they still existed. One of the clearest examples lies in the story of the Apgalu, the 7 sages. The texts describe them as ancient figures who brought knowledge to early humans after a great disaster. Not aliens, not supernatural beings, but symbolic memories of a time when wisdom was restored after loss. The Apgalu represent continuity, the handing down of what had survived. The Sumerians did not present these figures as mythic fantasies. They treated them as historical memory wrapped in story. Each sage corresponds to a city. Each city corresponds to a phase of rebuilding. Each phase corresponds to a reconstruction after destruction. These cycles echo archaeological evidence of repeated settlement abandonment across Mesopotamia during severe climate events. The sages were not literal, they were memory personified, and memory, once preserved in myth, becomes architecture. Look at their earliest temples. The proportions, the elevated platforms, the recessed niches, they carry the imprint of older structures built long before writing. Structures that appeared at sites scattered across northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia, where stone circles and megalithic enclosures ring with meaning we still cannot fully decode. These places were ceremonial, astronomical, aligned to cycles of stars and seasons. Their builders left no writing, but they left a language of architecture that survived in symbolic form. Sumer inherited that language. Even the orientation of their temples suggests continuity with far older sacred alignments. Some point toward the rising of key stars associated with seasonal changes. Some align with solstices. Some appear calibrated to the movement of Venus, a planet the earliest Sumerians tracked with a reverence that suggests long tradition. It is not that Sumer invented astronomy. It is that Sumer preserved a pattern of celestial observation that had begun long before writing existed. You see it even more clearly in their mathematics. Math is not cultural decoration. It is a tool shaped by practical need. And Sumer's earliest math is not trial and error. It is polished. It uses place value, advanced fractions, and standardized units with a confidence that implies generations of earlier work behind it. Their geometry was not primitive. It was deliberate, applied to fields, canals, architecture, and timekeeping. Their calculations show an understanding of ratios that seem almost intuitive, as if inherited through long tradition rather than discovered suddenly. Math is one of the hardest human tools to develop. It rarely begins complex, but in Sumer it does. This is why their earliest records feel so strange, because they speak the language of a society reviving something old, not creating something new. Even their earliest law codes reflect this. Instead of reading like the earliest attempts to formalize justice, they read like codifications of long-standing customs. Customs refined through countless generations. Customs shaped by experiences we can no longer map. Customs formed in societies that rose and fell long before writing. When you look closely at those laws, you see echoes of older moral structures, rules balancing community and individual, protecting the vulnerable, establishing fairness in trade, determining responsibility for harm. These rules suggest centuries of social evolution, not the first experiments of a newborn civilization. But the most haunting evidence of inherited knowledge lies not in math or law or architecture. It lies in something softer, more elusive: emotion. The earliest Sumerian poems are surprisingly tender. They speak of longing, of sorrow, of reverence, of the fragility of life. They express an emotional vocabulary that feels mature, reflective, aware of the smallness of human life in the face of time. Cultures write poetry only after they understand the world deeply enough to question it. You do not write lamentations unless you already know loss. You do not write hymns unless you already feel awe. You do not write epics unless you carry centuries of unspoken memory. Poetry emerges from experience, not invention. So whose experience was Sumer preserving? A civilization does not appear fully articulate unless it stands on the shoulders of worlds that left no writing. This becomes clearest when you examine the transition between prehistory and history. Sumer sits at that boundary like a threshold figure, half in shadow, half in light. Behind them stretch tens of thousands of years of human life, unwritten, unseen, but not unknown. Before them stretch millennia of recorded civilization, and Sumer, quietly, almost humbly, whispers the truth that ties those worlds together. We were not the first. We were the first who remembered. But even remembering is not enough to preserve everything. Memory fades, languages die, symbols lose meaning, myths become misunderstood, and the clay tablets, though durable, capture only a fraction of what once lived in the minds of the people who pressed their stories into them. Something larger slipped away, something deeper, something the Sumerians could sense but could not fully describe. A world behind their world, a knowledge behind their knowledge, a cycle behind their cycle. And the closer you look, the more you feel that presence behind them, like a shadow standing just outside the edges of recorded history. The clay tablets do not answer the question directly. They do not give us names or dates or clear descriptions. They only gesture, quietly, towards something that once existed and then faded. Something the Sumerians inherited in pieces. A world erased not by ignorance, but by time. A world whose shapes still linger in myth, in ritual, in architecture, in language. A world whose last light flickered in Sumer before the long night of forgetting overtook it completely. So again the question whispers, closer now, almost inside you. What was this world the Sumerians were trying to remember? What was this world the Sumerians were trying to remember? The question lingers like a shadow at the edge of the lamplight, present, but never fully stepping forward, never fully revealing itself. And maybe that is exactly how ancient memory works. Not as a clear picture, but as a faint outline. Not as certainty, but as presence. Something just beyond reach, just beyond language, just beyond the ability of clay to hold. When the Sumerians wrote about the time before, their words carried an ache that feels familiar to anyone who has ever sensed they belong to a story older than their own life. They spoke of ages when humans lived differently, when the world was governed by principles that later generations could only imitate. They wrote of periods when the boundaries between the natural and the divine felt thinner, when the sky and earth existed in closer dialogue. They did not describe this world as fantasy, they described it as memory. A broken memory, but a memory nonetheless. The tablets hint at a world where humans lived closer to the rhythms of the cosmos, where the movements of stars were not intellectual curiosities, but essential patterns woven into daily life. A world where climate, migration, survival, ritual and observation merged into a single cultural consciousness. A world shaped not by cities, but by landscapes, not by writing, but by repetition, not by kings, but by cycles. Everything the Sumerians preserved points backwards toward a civilization not defined by walls and bureaucracy, but by continuity. A world where knowledge flowed through generations without interruption. A world that existed before environmental catastrophe shattered the line of inheritance. The last great ice age ended violently. This is not myth, this is geology. Sea levels rose with astonishing speed, drowning coastal plains where human settlements had existed for thousands of years. Forests vanished beneath water. Rivers changed their courses. Entire continents shifted their shapes. What had been habitable land became seafloor. What had been familiar territory became alien overnight. Imagine the trauma of watching the world break. Imagine the stories survivors told their children. Stories about a world before the flood. Stories about a time when the earth was more stable, more predictable, more fertile. Stories about ancestors who lived in harmony with a world now gone. Stories passed down through centuries until they became myth, then legend, then fragmented whispers. These stories reached Sumer. The clay preserved them, and through those fragments we understand that the Sumerians saw themselves not as the architects of civilization, but as the inheritors of something older, a lineage of memory stretching back into a world lost to water and time. There are objects found in early Mesopotamian excavations that reinforce this sense of inheritance. Tiny cylinder seals carved with scenes more intricate than the earliest writing suggests should exist. Artifacts showing advanced iconography appearing suddenly without gradual development. Jewelry styles and ritual items that appear already refined from the earliest layers. These are not beginner attempts. They are late expressions of something earlier. The deeper you go in the soil, the more you encounter patterns without origins, symbols, motifs, architectural practices, mathematical habits, astronomical alignments. They appear without prelude, as if carried from another place. The world before Sumer was not empty. It was erased, and what little remained was carried forward in memory. This is not guesswork. This is visible in the archaeological layers. Beneath the earliest Sumerian cities lie earlier communities, farming villages, ritual sites, clay figurines, structures aligned to celestial events. These communities had practices that later reappear in Sumerian culture, refined and formalized. The continuity is unmistakable, but its root is invisible. And this invisibility creates a strange tension, because the Sumerians treat their inherited knowledge with reverence, as if they know they do not fully understand it, but also know they must preserve it anyway. There is humility in their approach to the cosmos. They describe themselves not as creators of the world, but as participants in a much older order. Their stories reflect this humility. The flood is not punishment, it is transition. The descent of kingship is not domination, it is restoration. The divine gifts of writing, agriculture, and measurement are not miracles, they are returns. Nothing in Sumer feels like a beginning. Everything feels like a retrieval. Even their agriculture, the heart of civilization, shows signs of older origins. The domesticated grains they cultivated did not emerge fully in Mesopotamia. Their genetic ancestry traces back to regions far older and farther north, near the foothills where other ancient ritual sites stand. Agriculture migrated. Knowledge migrated. People migrated. And when all these threads converged in the southern plains, Sumer crystallized. But the original source of that knowledge remained further back, further up, further into the mountains and beyond recorded time. Then there is the question of navigation. Early boat designs carved on seals show vessels capable of long-distance travel. far earlier than we once believed. The movement of obsidian, shells, metals, and pigments across vast distances implies a network of exchange long before cities existed. This network was not chaotic. It was organized. Its roots were remembered. And this memory flowed into Sumerian trade, language, and law. They inherited an interconnected world, but the names of the people who first wove that network are lost. Their voices are lost. Their stories are lost. Their languages are lost. Their symbols are half-remembered shadows. Their settlements lie beneath riverbeds, beneath layers of desert soil, beneath coasts that no longer exist. Sumer wrote what little survived. That is why so many of their myths feel like attempts to articulate trauma, the trauma of losing a world. Their gods are not cheerful figures. They are embodiments of forces that change the world abruptly. Storms, floods, droughts, wars, cosmic cycles. Their stories speak of balance disrupted and then restored, of knowledge lost and then regained. They describe humanity as a species that has forgotten and must learn anew. And maybe they were right, because you can feel something in the earliest Sumerian texts that modern readers rarely notice. A kind of sorrow. Not sorrow in the emotional sense, but sorrow in the historical sense. Sorrow for what was lost. Sorrow for what would never be recovered. Sorrow for a world that lived beyond the reach of writing. The Sumerians were the first people in history who could truly see memory slipping away and fight against it. That is why they wrote. They did not write from pride. They wrote from fear. Not fear of enemies or disasters, but fear of oblivion. Fear that the fragile thread of memory connecting them to their ancestors would break. And despite their efforts, most of that memory did break. The world before Sumer dissolved. Its stories collapsed into fragments of myth. Its knowledge survived only as symbols. Its language vanished. Its rituals blurred. Its architecture sank beneath sediment. Its people became shadows without names. What remains now are questions. Questions the Sumerians tried to answer with clay, with rhythm, with repetition, with reverence. Questions we continue to ask thousands of years later as we study the tablets they left behind. Questions that grow sharper the deeper we go. Because at some point, after reading enough of their texts, after studying enough artifacts, after tracing enough patterns across the ancient world, you begin to sense something that feels less like an idea and more like a presence. A presence just beyond the horizon of history. A presence that lived before the flood of forgetting. A presence that the Sumerians remembered in fragments. A presence we are only now beginning to recognize. Hidden beneath layers of earth, myth, silence, and time. And if that presence truly existed, then Sumer may not have been the first chapter of civilization. It may have been the first chapter we still have. The others are buried beneath the world we know. If the chapters before Sumer are buried, then what remains for us to read are not the full pages of humanity's earlier story, but the surviving margins, the edges, the pieces that endured because clay held what flesh could not, and because memory, even when broken, still refuses to die completely. And in those margins, something stirs. Something faint but insistent. Something that tells us there was once a continuity in human life that we have long forgotten. As you sit with this, the world around the Sumerians begins to feel different. It becomes quieter, slower, deeper. The sounds of their riverbanks and marketplaces drift away, and in their place emerges the long silence of the world before writing. A world moving on rhythms not entirely lost, but dulled by time. A world where people watched the sky each night because it was the only calendar they had. A world where survival was not an obstacle, but a rhythm. A world where knowledge was woven into story, and story was woven into ritual, and ritual was woven into the turning of seasons. And in that world, long before Sumer, something profound was learned. Something so essential that even after disasters tore the world apart, even after migrations scattered communities, even after languages fractured and died, fragments of that knowledge survived. Fragments that found their way onto clay tablets thousands of years later. Fragments that Sumer held with reverence, even when they no longer understood how those pieces had once connected. This is why the earliest Sumerian texts feel as if they are describing shadows of older truths. They speak of directions, not origins. They speak of restorations, not inventions. They speak of the ancient instructions, the ways from before, the knowledge that survived the waters. Even the gods they describe behave like metaphors for knowledge carried forward. Enki, the god of deep wisdom, emerges not as a creator, but as a preserver. One who, in their stories, saves humanity from losing everything by warning, by teaching, by passing on fragments that would otherwise be swallowed by the flood. Not literal instructions, but symbolic ones, like the fragmentary memories cultures carry after catastrophe. The flood itself is not presented as a singular moment. It is a symbol of loss and renewal repeated across cycles. The tablets describe people starting again, relearning agriculture, relearning time, relearning order. They describe the return of stability as a gift, something fragile, something that can vanish again. And beneath these stories lies a quiet confession. The Sumerians themselves did not fully understand the origin of the knowledge they carried. They saw themselves as living in the afterglow of an older world, the last inheritors of traditions whose full meaning had already slipped away. It is why their myths feel like echoes, resonant but incomplete. It is why their mathematics feels like a language inherited rather than invented. It is why their astronomy feels like a craft built on foundations older than their ruins. If you visit the ancient sites today, you feel this strange mixture of clarity and loss. You stand among the bricks of Uruk, and the ground feels heavy, as though holding memories that cannot rise to the surface. You walk along the remains of Eridu, and the air feels thick with the sense of repetition. Structures rebuilt on older structures, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, like a memory rewritten so many times that its original shape has blurred. And beneath those ruins lie layers of culture far older, cultures without writing but with meaning. People lived there for thousands of years before Sumer, shaping tools, shaping rituals, shaping lives. Their memory did not vanish, it flowed forward in fragments. But fragments can mislead. Fragments can confuse, fragments can contradict each other, and the Sumerians, despite their brilliance, could not restore everything. They preserved what they could, but the world before theirs was too vast, too complex, too fractured to fit perfectly into clay. This is why their earliest myths contain elements that feel strangely out of place. Images and symbols that seem older than their context. A fish-headed sage emerging from the sea with knowledge. A being of light measuring the heavens. a divine figure shaping the first map of the sky. These are not literal descriptions. They are metaphors built from half-remembered traditions. The symbols are older than the stories that contain them. Scholars often dismiss these images as pure myth, but myths are the oldest containers of memory humanity possesses. When a culture loses context for a piece of knowledge, that knowledge does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes story, image, symbol. It becomes the kind of thing that survives when detail cannot. The presence behind Sumer, the memory they were trying to preserve, was not supernatural. It was human. Human in the ancient sense. Human in the prehistoric sense. Human in the way that memory itself is human. This presence was not a lost race or a vanished empire. It was the collective memory of countless generations who lived before cities, before writing, before recorded chronology. People who watched coastlines sink beneath rising seas. People who survived droughts so long they were almost geological. People who crossed rivers that no longer exist. People who lived through environmental transformations so rapid and so violent that their entire world had to be relearned. These people carried knowledge forward. They taught it to their children taught it to theirs, and so on through uncounted generations, until the world stabilized and Sumer emerged. Sumer was not the beginning. Sumer was the point where memory became stable. Writing did not create knowledge. Writing preserved the final stage of it. Before writing, memory was alive, fluid, adaptive, spoken. After writing, memory crystallized. It solidified into tablets that outlasted their writers. But something was lost in that transformation. Fluid memory can evolve. Crystallized memory cannot. And so, what Sumer wrote down was not the full truth of the world before theirs. It was the fossil of that truth, preserved but incomplete. Their language still carries hints of older forms. Their rituals echo older patterns. Their city layouts follow older alignments. Their myths preserve older cosmologies. Their measurements reflect older systems. Their calendars refine older cycles. Everything in Sumer points backward, but the thing it points to no longer exists. Not in clay, not in stone, not in ruins, not in names, not in records. It exists only in silence. The silence of the world before history. The silence beneath the layers. The silence that Sumer tried, in its own fragile way, to break. And yet, even with all these fragments, all these hints, all these echoes, a deeper question remains. The question that haunts archaeologists, linguists, historians, storytellers, and anyone who has ever stared at a clay tablet and felt the weight of something missing. If the world before Sumer shaped everything Sumer became, what shaped that world? What lay behind the cultures erased by flood and time? What memory did they carry from even earlier eras? How far back does the human story go before writing finally captured its fading outline? And is it possible that the greatest chapter of humanity's past is one that no tablet, no ruin, no myth has fully preserved? If the greatest chapter of humanity's past has vanished, then what we are left with is not a full story, but a silhouette. A faint outline traced around something immense. A shape we can sense, but never fully see. The more we search, the more we realize that Sumer is only the first visible island rising above a vast ocean of forgotten time. The world before Sumer does not speak in full sentences. It speaks in fragments, stone fragments, symbolic fragments, linguistic fragments, astronomical fragments. And fragments do not explain themselves. They wait for recognition. This is why the earliest cities feel so eerie. Not because they were primitive, but because they were not. The first ziggurats stand like memories disguised as architecture, the way a dream sometimes disguises truth in symbols. The earliest temples sit on older foundations, and those older foundations sit on older earth, shaped by hands that belong to people whose names are long lost to both history and myth. If you remove the layers one by one, the story becomes not simpler, but stranger. Imagine peeling away the outer brick of a ziggurat, revealing the next layer underneath, older, less refined, but unmistakably guided by a plan. Peel another layer, then another. Each layer takes you further back in time, and each layer reveals a structure more modest than the last, but always in the same sacred footprint, always pointing in the same direction, always repeating the same pattern. A pattern carried through centuries of rebuilding. A pattern so important that no generation dared alter it. But who designed the first version of that pattern? No tablet answers this. No inscription explains it. The knowledge existed before writing. And when writing finally arrived, the meaning behind the blueprint had already faded. This is how memory decays. Not like a building collapsing in a day, but like a story told so many times that its details soften, its names blur, its events dissolve into metaphor, until only its skeleton remains. Sumer preserved the skeleton. The flesh was already gone. You can see this decay in their star charts. The earliest astronomical tablets reveal a knowledge that seems disproportionate to their era. They tracked Venus with extraordinary precision. They mapped the constellations with care. They divided the sky into sectors that resemble systems used by later civilizations across the ancient world. But the tablets do not explain how they learn this. They do not describe the long process of observation required to notice these cycles. They present them as facts, facts inherited, not discovered. And behind inherited knowledge lies inherited memory. Astronomy is not practical without purpose. People watch the skies closely only when the sky governs survival. That means the roots of Sumerian astronomy must lie in a world where celestial movements were not academic curiosities, but essential guides. Guides for migration, planting, hunting, navigation. A prehistoric world where the sky was not just a ceiling, but a language. This older world left no star charts, but it left rhythms, it left instincts, it left stories about the heavens that survived in Sumerian hymns. The Sumerians remembered enough to rebuild the system, but not enough to explain its origin. Something about that is deeply human. We remember meaning long after we forget explanation. We repeat symbols long after we forget their purpose. We keep rituals long after we forget why they were created. And the Sumerians were no different. Their rituals reflect fragments of older worlds. The ceremonial cleansing of ziggurat staircases, the pouring of water in sacred channels, the offering of grains in quantities that match ancient harvest cycles. These practices cannot be traced to Sumer alone. They echo older cultures, cultures that existed before rising waters drowned their settlements. Cultures whose memory survived only through ritual repetition. Human beings repeat what they fear losing, and they ritualize what they do not understand. This is why Sumer's religion feels so ancient. It does not read like the origin of belief. It reads like the continuation of belief in a world struggling to remember its past. Their gods carry traits that are older than their myths. Some are shaped like forces of nature. Some resemble ancestral figures. Some reflect ritual roles passed through generations. The divine becomes a container for cultural memory. This is why the Sumerian gods often behave like teachers, organizers, architects, not because they were literal beings, but because the stories behind them were once stories of people preserving knowledge in eras of survival. Over time, memories of those ancestors transformed into divine archetypes. Knowledge became myth. Myth became religion. Religion became identity. And somewhere in that transformation, the original humans behind the myths disappeared entirely. This is not unique to Sumer. It is a universal pattern across the ancient world. When writing appears, myth is already fully formed, carrying memories of eras too distant for history to reach. The Sumerians were simply the first to write these memories down. Their tablets preserve the last echoes of the world behind recorded time. And yet, even in those echoes, something deeper stirs. Something that feels like the memory of a memory. A faint outline of an era even older than the ones their myths describe. The subtle traces of people who walked the earth in a time so distant that even myth fails to contain them. Because long before Sumer, humans lived through an age of glacial melt, of sudden sea rise, of landscapes shifting beneath their feet. They witnessed coastlines vanish, forests drown, and entire ecosystems collapse. They learned to adapt. They learned to migrate. They learned to carry knowledge not in libraries, but in stories and rituals. That world was not less advanced. It was simply different. Its knowledge was not written, it was embodied. And embodied knowledge leaves strange traces. You see those traces in the earliest tools. Microliths too precise for Stone Age stereotypes. Engraved bones marked with lunar cycles. Beads carved from materials sourced hundreds of miles away. You see it in the early structures aligned with celestial events. You see it in the sudden appearance of standardized measurements in far-flung areas. You see it in the emotional depth of cave art that reflects cognitive sophistication far older than Sumer. But these traces are incomplete. The people who created them left no writing. They left no temples. They left no cities of brick. They left only hints. A gesture carved in stone, a motif painted in ochre, a ritual repeated across continents. Their world was erased, slowly, drowned by rising seas, forgotten as new cultures replaced old ones. And yet, somehow, the memory of their knowledge survived long enough to shape the foundations of Sumer. A foundation we can feel but cannot name. A foundation we can sense but cannot reconstruct. A foundation so old that its memory exists only in fragments and echoes. This is why the Sumerians felt like restorers. They were not guessing at meaning. They were preserving what remained. They were writing what memory still whispered. They were honoring a lineage of knowledge older than their cities, older than their symbols, older than their language. And now, thousands of years later, we find ourselves in their position again, looking back into darkness, holding fragments, trying to reconstruct a story that will never fully reveal itself. Feeling the presence of something vast behind the earliest tablets. Something human, something lost, something waiting to be understood. Which brings us to the most haunting question of all. Not what shaped Sumer, but what shaped the world before Sumer. Because if Sumer was the echo, what was the original sound? If Sumer was the echo, then somewhere in the depths of humanity's forgotten past lies the original sound, the source that shaped the earliest memories preserved in clay. But what could that source have been? What kind of world produces knowledge that survives catastrophe, survives migration, survives the collapse of entire landscapes, only to re-emerge centuries later in the earliest written tablets? To even approach this question, we must let go of the modern idea that civilization progresses step by step, from simple to complex, without interruption. The archaeological record does not reflect a neat staircase. It reflects waves. It reflects cycles. It reflects long stretches of growth interrupted abruptly, followed by long stretches of silence. It reflects knowledge gained, then lost, then rediscovered in distorted forms. Sumer emerges from one of these cycles, not as the first spark of humanity's brilliance, but as the first spark that survived long enough to be written. The world behind Sumer is not a mystery because it was primitive. It is a mystery because it left no script. And no script means no chronology. No chronology means no story. Only silence. But silence is not emptiness. Silence holds memory differently. Silence preserves shape without detail. Silence carries the outline of something vast without revealing its face. When archaeologists explore the oldest layers beneath Mesopotamian cities, they find the remains of cultures older than Sumer by thousands of years. Cultures with pottery traditions, symbolic carvings, ritualized structures, and trade connections stretching across miles of terrain. These people were not isolated bands of wanderers. They were organized, creative, observant. They watched the stars. They tracked the seasons. They understood the land intimately. The world they inhabited was not less advanced. It was simply non-literate. It preserved its knowledge in bodies, not in tablets. In repetition, not in ink. In story, not in law codes. In ritual gesture, not in architectural plans. When a non-literate world collapses, it collapses almost completely. Its memory survives only as myth, symbol, habit, instinct. And this is where the Sumerian world begins, at the tail end of a memory so faint that only pieces remained. Consider the strange consistency in early Near Eastern creation myths. Across multiple cultures, we see stories of a primeval order disrupted by a cosmic event, followed by the restoration of structure. These stories are symbolic, not historical, but symbolism is not fiction. Symbolism is memory disguised as metaphor. The cosmic battle, the taming of waters, the division of realms, these themes reflect the remembrance of real transitions. Perhaps environmental transitions, perhaps social transitions, perhaps the shift from nomadic to settled life, perhaps the collapse of an older network of knowledge. People encode trauma in myth. People encode loss in myth. People encode memory in myth. The flood stories are the clearest example. Nearly every culture surrounding ancient Mesopotamia carries some version of it. The details differ, but the emotional foundation remains. A world lost to water. a world wiped clean, a world reshaped. This does not have to point to a single event. It points to a long period of environmental upheaval at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, swallowing entire coastlines where early settlements might have thrived. Those settlements left no trace. Their memory survived only in story. Sumer was the first civilization to record those stories, but Sumer was not the first to live them. And if those vanished coastal cultures had astronomical knowledge, as the alignments of some early megalithic sites suggest, then the Sumerians may have inherited fragments of a system too old to fully decode. This is why their star charts appear sophisticated from the start. This is why their calendar already reflects long-term observations. This is why their myths speak of a time when the measures of heaven were given to humanity. These phrases do not imply supernatural events. They imply the reappearance of knowledge after a long interruption. And behind that knowledge lies human memory. Memory is shaped by crisis. Memory is shaped by survival. Memory is shaped by the need to preserve meaning. Many early carvings found across the ancient world show repeated geometric patterns, circles, spirals, intersecting lines, sequences of marks. Scholars often label these as decorative, but decoration is rarely meaningless. These patterns may have represented cycles, seasons, timekeeping, or cosmological principles once understood intuitively. These symbols appear thousands of years before Sumer, and then reappear in Sumerian iconography, transformed but recognizable. The continuity is undeniable, even if the meaning has faded. The world behind Sumer communicated in symbols long before it communicated in writing, and symbols are easier to preserve but harder to interpret. The Sumerians inherited symbols from a world that no longer existed. They translated what they could into clay. They mythologized the rest. But some symbols remain fragments, floating without context, preserved only because they were considered sacred. The winged disk, the seven-pointed star, the serpent entwined around a rod, the tree with branches above and roots below. These images appear across multiple ancient cultures, echoing something shared, something old, something the Sumerians tried to honor, even when its original meaning was lost. One of the most mysterious remnants is the notion of sacred numbers, specific values appearing repeatedly in early texts. Numbers like 60, 7, 12, 30. These numerical motifs appear too consistently across early civilizations to be coincidence. They relate to cycles of time, to celestial bodies, to human biology, to patterns of life. But the earliest references to these numbers in Sumer do not explain them. They assume understanding that no longer existed. Sumer inherited a numerical world, but the key to that world's logic was gone. This is the tragedy of ancient memory. The more generations that pass, the more explanation dissolves, leaving only patterns behind. And patterns are easily misinterpreted unless their original purpose is known. The Sumerians preserved patterns without understanding them fully. We preserved the tablets without understanding the Sumerians fully. And so the distance between the present and the world behind Sumer grows. Yet, despite this distance, something remains, something unmistakable, a sense of continuity, a sense of inheritance, a sense of a world that came before, so ancient that even the Sumerians saw it only through the fog of memory. That world is not accessible excavations alone. It exists in the gaps, the absences, the silences, the shadows between known eras. It exists in the sudden appearance of complex systems. It exists in the inexplicable maturity of early writing. It exists in the emotional weight of Sumerian myths. It exists in the geometry of ziggurats. It exists in the strange precision of early calendars. It exists in the structure of a language with no ancestor. It exists in the sudden stability of a world that should have taken centuries to refine. And behind all of it lies the faint outline of a forgotten age. A world not lost because it was primitive, but because it had no mechanism to preserve itself when catastrophe struck. A world whose whispers shaped the earliest civilizations. A world whose echoes shaped the first written stories. A world whose memory shaped Sumer. A world whose presence still lingers on the edge of our understanding. It is this presence that draws us deeper. It is this presence that Sumer tried to capture in clay. It is this presence that we sense when we read their oldest tablets. It is this presence that refuses to disappear. And as we move further into the story, one question rises like a distant horizon. If a world existed behind Sumer, and Sumer preserved only its last echoes, how far back does the human story truly go? If the human story reaches farther back than Sumer, then we are no longer looking at history. We are looking at something more like deep time. A stretch of humanity so vast, so ancient, that even the act of imagining it feels like trying to see through water. The outline is there, but the details ripple out of reach. The further back we gaze, the more the past becomes a kind of dusk, neither light nor dark, neither known nor unknown. And yet, even from that dusk, something calls to us. A familiarity, a recognition, a feeling that humanity did not begin at the point where writing begins. Humanity began long before that, shaped by lessons we no longer remember clearly. If you walk down the timeline of human existence, Sumer stands shockingly close to us. Civilization, as we define it, cities, writing, law codes, takes up only the last sliver of our species' lifespan. Before that lies an ocean of time, hundreds of thousands of years, generations beyond counting, lives lived in worlds with climates, landscapes, and skies utterly different from ours. What were those worlds like? What knowledge did they hold? What memories did they pass on that eventually reached Sumer in fragments? These questions feel strange because they ask us to imagine a world without writing. But writing is only one way to remember. Before writing, memory lived in rhythm, in repetition, in ritual, in story, in bodies moving through landscapes shaped by migration and season. What Sumer captured in clay were the last notes of a very old song. Look closely at the earliest myths, and you can hear those notes. The way the Sumerians speak of human life before the flood. Peaceful, long-lived, deeply connected to the divine order, does not reflect historical reality. It reflects longing for a time when life was not yet fractured by disasters and migrations and the slow disintegration of memory. Longing for a world that felt whole. Every culture in the ancient Near East shares this longing. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, the Hittites, the Hurrians. They all preserve some faint memory of a world before the world they knew. A world of ancestors who lived in greater harmony, greater closeness to nature, greater understanding. This does not refer to a golden age in the literal sense. It refers to a pre-catastrophe age, a pre-displacement age, a pre-forgetting age. A time before the great ruptures of climate and geography scattered human communities and fragmented their knowledge. The last ice age was not simply a time of cold. It was a time of stability, the same stability humans rely on to maintain cultural memory. People lived in the same regions for generations. They taught their children for centuries. They knew their landscapes intimately. They did not need writing because they had continuity. Then the ice melted and continuity shattered. Floods drowned the coasts. Rivers carved new paths. Habitats disappeared. Animals migrated. People fled. Languages collided. Traditions transformed. Memory fractured. Imagine knowledge being passed from one generation to the next for thousands of years, only to collapse in a single lifetime. Imagine stories losing context so quickly they turn from memory into myth. Imagine rituals performed by people who no longer remember why the ritual existed. This is what lies behind Sumer, a world remembered by people who barely understood what they were remembering. But sometimes memory survives in more unexpected places. Consider the strange sophistication of their earliest medical texts. They list plants, minerals, oils and practices that required generations of experimentation to refine. They distinguish between symptoms and diseases. They document cause and effect. Such knowledge does not spring from nothing. It is inherited from older healers whose names are lost, whose practices predate cities, whose memory survived only because some apprentice carried fragments into the next world. Consider the early mathematical techniques. The ability to divide land precisely, to calculate areas and volumes, to structure temples with proportions that reflect cosmic order. This is not a beginner's mind. This is a mind that remembers something. Consider the earliest hymns, poems written in a language already refined, using metaphors that feel ancient even when preserved in clay. These were not written by a young civilization. They were written by a culture already carrying centuries of thought. Everything about Sumer feels like the end of a long corridor, not the beginning of one. And this is why the presence behind Sumer feels so haunting, because it suggests that the real foundation of human civilization lies in a world we can barely see, a world erased not by ignorance, but by disaster. Archaeology gives us glimpses of that world, not clear pictures, but outlines. The settlement mounds from the late Neolithic, the stone circles whose purpose is lost, the early agricultural communities that thrived in the hills before the plains were habitable, the ancient trade networks that connected distant regions long before writing, the carved figurines that reflect emotional depth, not primitive superstition, the early calendars etched into bone, the astronomical alignments built into structures older than history. These fragments tell us that humanity was not waiting in darkness for civilization to begin. Humanity was building meaning long before clay tablets appeared. Humanity was developing systems older than writing, older than cities, older than the languages that carried them. The Sumerians inherited the last embers of a world that had already lived and died. And the deeper we look into those embers, the more we sense that something profound happened before the flood of forgetting, something that shaped the human story so deeply that traces of it survive even now, embedded in myth, symbol, number, and instinct. It is not that this older world was more advanced in the modern sense. It did not have machines or cities or metal. Its sophistication lay elsewhere, in its continuity, its relationship with the land, its understanding of cycles, its cultural memories spanning millennia. And when that world collapsed, the memory of its knowledge survived only in the faintest forms. But faint is not meaningless. Faint is still memory. Memory preserved by people who believed that forgetting was a form of death. This is why the Sumerians clung to ritual, why they rebuilt their temples repeatedly, why they preserved star cycles, why they codified laws, why they carved myths into clay. They were holding on to memory the way someone holds on to a fading dream. And as you trace these threads, a picture begins to emerge, slowly, quietly, like something rising from the depths of water. A picture not of a lost civilization in the sensational sense, but of a lost continuity, a lost lineage of knowledge, a lost familiarity with the world that once existed. The Sumerians were not remembering one lost culture. They were remembering the end of many. They were writing the final chapter of a story whose first chapters dissolved into myth. Which leads to another question both simple and profound. If humanity has forgotten entire ages of its own past, how many times have we begun again? If humanity has begun again more than once, then the story of civilization is not a straight line. It is a cycle, a pulse, a breathing in and out across the ages, a rising and collapsing, like tides shaped by forces we no longer witness. The Sumerians stood at one crest of that long tide, not the first and not last, but the first to leave behind a record sturdy enough to resist the undertow of time. But even they knew they were not the beginning. Their tablets speak of forgotten ages the way a person speaks of dreams fading upon waking, remembered in fragments, significant in feeling even when the details dissolve. They mention older cities, older rulers, older eras that existed before known history. Yet they never claim to fully understand what came before them. They write as though they are picking up a story mid-sentence with only the faintest idea of what the opening chapters contained. When you look closely at the ruins beneath their cities, you start to understand what they sensed. Beneath the foundations of Sumerian temples lie the remains of earlier shrines, structures smaller, simpler, but following similar layouts. Beneath those shrines lie even older gathering places whose original purpose cannot be deciphered, but whose alignment to celestial events hints at rituals that stretched back into prehistory. These older structures did not survive accidentally. They survived because each generation rebuilt the sacred on the same footprint, honoring something so ancient that its origin had already been forgotten. The Sumerians were rebuilding on memory, not innovation. And when memory is all you have, it becomes instinct, an invisible guide shaping your choices even when you no longer know why you make them. This is why the earliest known maps come from Sumer, not because they were the first to conceptualize land, but because they inherited a tradition of spatial awareness that once lived in the minds of people who navigated long distances without writing. Their maps capture rivers, mountains, and cities, but behind those drawings is something older. A worldview where humans understood their environment intimately enough to survive shifts in landscapes and migrations that stretched across generations. The world before Sumer was not chaotic. It was precise in its own way. But when writing arrived, the explanation behind that precision was already gone. This is the strange tension that defines early civilization. Knowledge survives longer than understanding. Memory survives longer than meaning. Form survives longer than function. You can see this in Sumerian medicine. They record treatments that clearly worked, remedies that required generations of trial and error to refine. But they do not record the rationale behind them. The chain of cause and effect had broken. The practice remained, the principle was lost. You can see it in their mathematics. They record perfect ratios, perfect divisions, perfect astronomical cycles. But they do not record how those discoveries were made. The knowledge is continuous. The method is invisible. You can see it in their art. Their earliest figurines and symbols resemble those found in much older Neolithic sites. But the meaning behind the symbols had faded into tradition. They carved because ancestors had carved. They painted patterns because ancient hands had painted them first. You can see it in their religious rituals. They reenacted ceremonies older than their own myths. They followed steps inherited from a world that no longer existed. They performed these rituals with reverence, but not with comprehension. To them, sacredness lay not in understanding, but in repetition. This is the world that shaped Sumer, a world built on the last surviving threads of prehistoric memory. And yet, for all we can reconstruct, something remains out of reach. Something central. Something that the Sumerians themselves could not grasp. Consider their obsession with order. They structured their calendars precisely. They aligned their buildings deliberately. They measured time with intervals that reflect cosmic cycles. This obsession does not emerge from a society finding its way. It emerges from a society trying desperately to preserve the rhythm of an older world. A rhythm that had once governed life so effectively that its loss felt like a fracture. The Sumerians rebuilt that rhythm in clay and brick. They reinstated calendars that had drifted. They revived rituals whose purpose had dimmed. They re-established cosmic order in the form of measurement. Why? Because something had broken before they arrived. Because something about the world had shifted. Because they felt they were living after an ending. Their myths describe this feeling openly. They speak of ages that ended in chaos. They speak of knowledge that had to be restored, not created. They speak of a great forgetting that humans suffered. They speak of a time when the connection between heaven and earth, symbolically between cosmos and culture, was disrupted. This is why the earliest kings are not portrayed as conquering heroes. They are portrayed as restorers of order. Kingship in Sumerian thought is not about dominance. It is about continuity. It descends from heaven because heaven symbolizes stability, not supernatural beings. Kingship returns after disruption because disruption was seen as the natural state of forgotten memory. This worldview is not philosophical invention. It is cultural trauma expressed in narrative. It is what you say when your ancestors lived through environmental collapse so severe that it fractured the continuity of knowledge itself. And so the question shifts again. Not simply what came before Sumer, but what ended before Sumer. The answer is not dramatic. It is geological. It is environmental. It is slow, then sudden. The world changed around 10,000 BCE. It changed again around 6000 BCE. Rivers flooded, then dried. Coastlines rose. Food sources shifted. Habitats collapsed. People moved. Knowledge scattered. By the time Sumer rose, the world had begun again many times. But only in Sumer did writing appear. And writing preserves the last layer of memory, not the first. This is why Sumer feels both young and old at the same time. Their cities are new, their language is isolated, their tablets are fresh. But their ideas feel ancient. Their rituals feel inherited. Their measurements feel refined. Their stories feel old. The deeper you go into their culture, the more you feel as though you are moving through the ruins of a world built on the ruins of older worlds still. Each layer a copy of a copy, each memory softened by centuries of forgetting. And if humanity did restart more than once, then Sumer becomes not a beginning, but a hinge, a turning point between the darkness of prehistory and the fragile light of recorded time. A hinge is not the door. A hinge is not the frame. A hinge is the point where movement becomes possible. Sumer is the hinge of human memory. The world behind them is the unseen door. The world after them is the room we live in now. And through that hinge, one final question slips quietly through, so soft you almost miss it. If our past has collapsed before, how much of what we call civilization is simply humanity remembering itself? If civilization is humanity remembering itself, then what we call progress is not a climb upward, but a return, a slow rediscovery of things we once knew, forgotten not through failure, but through time. And somewhere deep in the ancient memory that flows beneath Sumer, beneath the flood stories, beneath the layers of soil and silence, lies the truth that humanity has begun again more times than we realize. This realization is not frightening, it is grounding. It tells us that the past is not a single straight line, but a series of arcs, some bright, some dim, all curving toward the same horizon. And Sumer stands at one of those arcs, the first point at which human memory became visible again, the moment when knowledge stopped dissolving in the air and instead hardened into clay, the moment when time ceased to be abstract and became something you could hold. But even as they wrote their world into permanence, the Sumerians understood that memory is fragile. Their prayers often mention how easily order slips into confusion, how quickly clarity fades, how necessary it is to repeat rituals so that meaning does not disappear. They lived with the awareness that civilization is always walking along the edge of forgetting. Perhaps this is why their myths describe humanity not as beings who rise once, but as beings who rise again. Perhaps they sensed, in the faint echo of older stories, that their ancestors had lived through cycles of creation and collapse. Perhaps they understood that they themselves might one day become part of another forgotten age. It is humbling to think that the Sumerians, a civilization so ancient to us, felt ancientness behind them, that even they looked backward into darkness and asked, what was before us? And maybe that is the quiet lesson preserved in their clay tablets, that human knowledge does not begin at a single point, but emerges again and again from the ruins of earlier worlds, that we are not the first to wonder who we are, that we are not the first to fear forgetting, that we are not the first to carry fragments of stories too old to fully understand. When you view humanity through this lens, something shifts. The past becomes deeper, the present becomes smaller, and the future becomes less linear. Sumer no longer feels like the root of civilization. It feels like a mirror reflecting something older. The temples aligned to stars, the myths about forgotten ages, the mathematics too refined to be first attempts. All of it points gently, respectfully, toward a lineage of knowledge that does not belong to one culture alone, but to humanity as a whole. A lineage that survived fire and flood, migration and starvation, war and silence. A lineage carried by countless unnamed ancestors whose lives left no ruins, but whose memories shaped the earliest cities. A lineage written in clay only at the very end of its long journey. And as you follow that lineage forward, through Sumer, through Babylon, through Greece, through Rome, through every civilization that built upon the bones of another, you begin to understand something that the Sumerians understood instinctively. No era is truly new. No civilization stands alone. No knowledge belongs to a single generation. We inherit more than we create. We restore more than we invent. We remember more than we realize. And the clay tablets of Sumer, the oldest written memories of our species, whisper this truth with a calm certainty. There was something before us, something fragile, something ancient, something human. And as the story of Sumer draws closer to its end, one final realization settles gently into place, like dust settling into the grooves of a tablet. What we call the beginning of history may actually be the final chapter of a world that came before. A world whose last echoes the Sumerians captured, before silence claimed it once more. If the first chapter of recorded history is really the last chapter of an older world, then the clay tablets left by the Sumerians are not just documents. They are a threshold, a doorway between two eras, one that could be written and one that could only be remembered. Standing before that threshold, the Sumerians behaved not as pioneers, but as guardians. They gathered what remained. They shaped memory into form. They translated the final echoes of prehistory into symbols pressed into clay. They did what humans have always done when confronted with the vastness of the past. They made meaning out of fragments. And in those fragments, something essential survives. Not the full story, but the shape of a story. Not the complete memory, but the outline of one. When you listen closely to that outline, you begin to understand why the earliest written records do not describe invention. They describe rediscovery, rebuilding, realignment, restoration. The Sumerians were not celebrating a new world. They were mourning the end of an old one and preserving the parts they still understood. Even their myths reflect this sense of living after an ending. The stories do not begin with creation, they begin with recreation. The gods do not bring forth the world from nothing, they reorganize it after chaos. They restore the boundaries, they reconstruct the order. This is not the imagination of a young culture, it is the remembrance of an old one, a remembrance of cycles, a remembrance of collapse, a remembrance of loss so profound that the only way to survive it was to shape it into story. The Sumerians inherited the emotional memory of that collapse, even if they no longer understood its cause. They felt the outline of something older, the way you might feel the shape of a dream after waking, intimate in sensation, unreachable in detail. And so they wrote down everything they could, perhaps sensing that another cycle might come, perhaps knowing how fragile human knowledge truly is. Because the Sumerians did not write with confidence in permanence, they wrote with fear of oblivion. That fear appears again and again in their tablets, a fear that the order they restored might unravel, a fear that the memories they held might fade, a fear that the fragile continuity they rebuilt could be broken again. It is this fear, not pride, that drove them to record the world so meticulously. The weight of ancient forgetting pressed on them just as it presses on us. And this is where the story begins to circle back toward the present, because in the Sumerian experience we recognize ourselves. We too live after endings. We too live with fragments. We too inherit the last echoes of eras whose names we do not know. We too struggle to understand symbols older than our archives. We too fear forgetting. The difference is only that the Sumerians wrote it into clay, while we scatter our words into digital winds. But the underlying impulse is the same. We document because we do not trust memory to endure. We preserve because we sense how easily knowledge dissolves. We reach backward because we are trying to understand who we are. The Sumerians reached backward in the same way, and the world they found behind them was a silhouette, vast, fragmented, meaningful, and lost. But even as we mourn the loss of that ancient world, there is something strangely beautiful about what remains, because the fragments passed through the Sumerians into us. The memories they preserved became the foundation for every civilization that followed. Their symbols became ours. Their measurements shape our time. Their myths shaped our imagination. Their language influenced our languages indirectly. Their stories became the roots of countless others. A lost world survives in the fingerprints it left on Sumer, and through Sumer, in us. There is comfort in knowing that nothing human is ever truly lost. It may fade, it may blur, it may collapse into silence, but it leaves traces, in myth, in ritual, in instinct, in architecture, in numbers, in the soft places of the human mind where memory becomes story. And as we follow those traces, we find ourselves approaching the final conclusion. Not a solution, not an answer, but a perspective. A way of seeing the ancient world that dissolves the idea of beginnings and endings, replacing them instead with cycles, rhythms, and returns. The Sumerians were not the first civilization. They were the first civilization visible to us. Behind them stands a lineage of forgotten worlds, worlds erased by time, remembered only in fragments, yet still alive in the foundations of everything humanity became. And now, as the story nears its end, the last question rises like a slow, inevitable tide, gentle, soft, and infinitely deep. If Sumer stands at the threshold of human memory, what does it say about the world we live in now? If Sumer stands at the threshold of human memory, then the world we live in now stands at another threshold, one that mirrors it more closely than we might expect. Sumer lived after a collapse they did not remember clearly. We live after a continuity we rarely question. They inherited fragments from a world erased by water and time. We inherit the illusion that nothing will ever be erased again. They pressed stories into clay because they feared forgetting. We scatter stories into servers because we assume permanence. But memory, no matter how it is stored, always walks along the edge of disappearance. And so the Sumerian tablets offer us not just information about the ancient world, but a reminder about our own. A reminder that knowledge is fragile, a reminder that continuity is not guaranteed, a reminder that civilizations do not rise once. They rise whenever memory is strong enough to carry them forward, and they fall whenever memory weakens. When you read the oldest Sumerian texts carefully, you sense a quiet warning embedded inside them, a warning that feels less like prophecy and more like experience. They knew what it meant for a world to disappear. They knew what it meant to rebuild in the shadow of loss. They knew what it meant to stand on a fragile threshold between remembering and forgetting. Perhaps that is why their myths linger on cycles. The cycle of the seasons, the cycle of floods, the cycle of kingship, the cycle of divine withdrawal and return, the cycle of creation and dissolution. These cycles were not abstract concepts to them. They were lived reality. The ancient world had taught them that nothing human remains unchanged. And perhaps that is the true message of the Sumerian tablets. Not simply what they remembered, but what they knew would eventually be forgotten. When you think of the world this way, with history as a chain of memories carried forward through crisis, the question shifts. It becomes less about what Sumer remembered and more about what we are forgetting. Because we too live in a time of overwhelming information. We too stand in a world where meaning fractures. We too
feel the pull of cycles we cannot fully name. We too sense that the story of humanity is deeper than our textbooks allow. And like the Sumerians, we sometimes mistake complexity for progress, forgetting that complexity without memory is brittle, forgetting that knowledge without history floats without context, forgetting that meaning must be preserved intentionally, patiently, lovingly, or else it fades into the background noise of time. The beauty of Sumer is that they did not try to present themselves as the first. They stood with humility. They wrote as inheritors. They honored what came before them, even when they could not understand it fully. This humility is what gives their story emotional weight. Because they did not write to glorify themselves, they wrote to keep memory alive. And in doing so, they became our bridge to the deep past. Imagine the scale of that bridge, one end reaching into the present, our world of lights and screens, the other end reaching into a world so ancient that its people lived with mammoths and shifting ice. And in between those ends lies a thin line of continuity held together by clay. Clay that survived fire, clay that survived burial, clay that survived conquest, flood, and time. Clay that carries the last whisper of an era otherwise lost. When you hold a Sumerian tablet in your hands, you are holding a memory rescued from extinction, a thought that survived the collapse of worlds, a whisper pressed into earth by someone who believed, perhaps desperately, that the future needed to remember. And now, thousands of years later, we do remember. But we remember only the faintest outline, the names of kings, the myths of gods, the lists of offerings, the measurements of fields, the maps of rivers. But beneath these details, something larger waits quietly. A presence, a pattern, a truth too large for any single tablet to contain. Something the Sumerians felt but could not explain. Something we sense but cannot define. Something older than cities, older than agriculture, older than writing. The continuity of humanity itself. The Sumerians were not trying to preserve their world.
They were trying to preserve ours. They sensed that memory is the only true inheritance a civilization has. They sensed that forgetting is the only true collapse. They sensed that the ancient world behind them was already slipping beyond reach, and they left behind their tablets as a kind of lantern, a small flickering light in the darkness of time, guiding us back toward a story too vast to be written. And now, as this narrative begins to settle toward its final resting place, one last realization comes softly into view, gentle, inevitable, and comforting in its quiet truth. Perhaps the deepest purpose of Sumer was not to begin history, but to remind us that history is only the shallowest part of who we are. If history is only the shallowest part of who we are, then the deeper layers of humanity lie not in the timelines we memorize, but in the memories we carry without realizing it. Memories older than writing, older than cities, older than the very idea of civilization. Memories that drift through our instincts, our symbols, our rituals, our longing for meaning. Memories that surface gently when we stand in ancient places, when we touch old stone, when we read old myths, when we wander deserts or forests or mountains that feel strangely familiar, even though we have never been there before. Perhaps this is why the story of Sumer still resonates, not because it is the beginning, but because it is the last visible fragment of something far older. The last time memory survived long enough to be written down before the long silence beneath prehistory swallowed the rest. The Sumerians captured the moment when humanity stepped out of forgetting, not into understanding, but into remembrance. They preserved the faint outline of a world behind theirs, and they passed that outline to us. And through them, we inherit not just their knowledge, but the memory of older ages that shaped them. Ages defined by cycles of climate and movement. Ages of stability followed by collapse. Ages in which people were forced to begin again. And now we understand that this pattern is not unique to them. It is human. It is our nature. To survive, to rebuild, to remember in fragments, to carry forward what little we can. Every civilization we know, Egypt, China, Greece, Rome, emerges already holding something older than itself. Every tradition carries symbols whose origins we cannot locate. Every language contains echoes of forms long extinct. Every ritual hides the traces of a world we no longer recognize. And if all of this is true, then maybe the real story of humanity is not the rise of civilization, but the endurance of memory. Not memory in the literal sense, but memory in the deeper sense, the kind that persists even when its origins dissolve, the kind that lives in intuition, in rhythm, in architecture, in cosmology, in the way every culture mirrors the same ancient patterns even after being separated by continents and centuries. This deeper memory is the thread connecting us to the distant past, the same thread the Sumerians tried to preserve in clay. Their tablets are not simply old, they are familiar. They feel familiar because they speak a language humanity has spoken since long before writing existed, a language of cycles, a language of resilience, a language of forgetting and remembering, a language of rebuilding after loss. And so, as this story settles toward its final breath, you may feel something subtle in yourself, a quiet recognition, not of information, but of connection. A sense that Sumer's world is not far away. A sense that the ancient memory behind Sumer's tablets still lives in you.
woven into the deepest places of human thought. Because we are not separate from the ancient world, we are the continuation of it. We are the latest chapter in a story that began long before clay tablets, long before myths, long before written language, long before the rivers of Mesopotamia carved their paths across the earth. And when you lie in bed listening to stories like this, when your breathing slows, when your mind drifts into the soft inward landscapes of night, you become part of the same human rhythm that carried memory through countless eras. The same rhythm that shaped the world behind Sumer. The same rhythm that Sumer preserved. The same rhythm that carries us now. There is something deeply comforting in this, a sense that we are not alone in time, a sense that the past is not lost, it is only quiet, a sense that the knowledge of earlier worlds still lives in our collective memory, waiting patiently, the way clay waits under earth for the right hands to uncover it. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is the simplest. Civilizations fall, knowledge fades, languages disappear, worlds collapse, memory fractures. But humanity continues, again and again, cycle after cycle, age after age. And through each cycle, we carry forward the faint light of what came before, a light passed from hand to hand, from story to story, from symbol to symbol, from ruin to ruin, from age to age, until today, when you are hearing it again. The Sumerians did not expect us. They did not know who would read their tablets. They pressed clay because they feared forgetting, not because they imagined a future audience. Yet here you are, listening in the dark, centuries after their world crumbled to dust, hearing the last echo of their memory breathe softly through time. And maybe that is the real miracle. Not the clay, not the cities, not the myths, but the simple fact that memory survived at all, that something of humanity endured the long night of forgetting and reached you. So now, as you lie there, calm, breathing slowly, eyes drifting toward rest, you can let this final thought settle gently inside you. History is the story we can see, but humanity is the story we can feel. And the Sumerians, in their fragile, beautiful attempt to preserve the past, left us a reminder that the deepest truths are not written in clay. They are written in us. Sleep well. You are part of a story older than time. Ancient Sumerian records that could change everything we know about humanity. History for Sleep.